let's take a quick jog sideways. We'll come back to outdoor exercises to a limited extent after Thanksgiving break. Can you believe it? This is our last class session for the next week and a half, and then we've got basically nothing left time-wise, and people are going to start getting real wide around the eyes as we get into exam season. That's okay. We're going to do something hopefully not arbitrarily difficult as an exam in this class, because exams don't reflect real life particularly well. That said, our sideways step today is back to other classes of resources beyond our infrastructural and experiential resources we've been working with, trying to lay out trails and getting a sense of what that really looks like in terms of the management trade-offs of, do I go straight down the slope expensively, ecologically, and budget-wise, or do I meander a trail that is literally 10 times longer to try and keep it ecologically sustainable and light on my fish habitat and so forth. So we're going to pivot over to air. So we're going to talk about physical air sheds. We're going to talk about air quality. We're going to talk about soundscapes as a function of the physical properties of air and how we use landscapes in ways that create noise as a function of recreation. We'll talk a little bit about scenic resources, so UV sheds, vista points, landscapes, right? A lot of those spots are beautiful and sought after as vista points and as experiences generally, is because air quality makes it possible for that spot to be a vista point in the first place. Now, we also need typically things like mountains or a Grand Canyon to sort of pair so that there's something interesting to look at out from that point. But even if there's something interesting or beautiful, like standing on the top of a mountain and seeing the entire landscape for over 100 miles in any direction on a very clear day, it doesn't matter if there's a beautiful clear landscape for 100 miles plus in any direction on a very clear day, if that clear day is choked off with smog. So let's take some peeks at examples of good and bad air quality, some of these at national parks, and kind of wrestle with what it's like to manage this fundamentally wicked problem, as they're called, in natural resource planning, of the tragedy of the commons. So you as the park ranger are doing your level best, you as a forester are doing your level best to clean the atmosphere with intact surface vegetation. Forests are like the N95 or KN95 mask of the planet. Forests pull out crazy amounts of particulate. And in particular, forests are really pretty good at pulling out the particulate that we inject into the atmosphere through our power plant smokestacks, out our tailpipes, also with our campfires and stuff like that. But here in the mostly developed Western Hemisphere, cook fires and sooty low temperature, ashy low temperature cook fires are not near as much as an issue as in the developing world, where people have to cook over fire all day long because they don't have an electric or gas range to do their cooking to make their food safe to eat. And bending over that fire all day, every day to tend the fire and the food, breathing in that smoke all day, every day, is a leading cause of human death and reduced health capacity. So dying earlier and being sicker for longer before you die across the world. So we want to take a minute to acknowledge here that we are coming at this air quality issue from a perspective of profound privilege based on, among other things, the Clean Air Act. The United States, although we produce about 1/6 of the world's CO2 equivalent emissions, and we are a lot less than 1/6 of the world population, we have the money, the resources, the technology, and the political will to pass things like the Clean Air Act. A lot of other cultures and countries and nations and states have given the USA a ton of grief over the years, and they're not completely wrong, for going hard on particulate air pollution for the sake of generating power, for the sake of heating homes, etc. And then kind of berating the rest of the world when we sort of get the insight to pass the Clean Air Act and clean up our act, and then demanding that others do the same as we do without the same resources that we have to do it. So it's kind of a long sermony preamble, but all this is to say that managing air as a resource is really hard because somebody literally halfway around the world could be causing the problem for you, and their bad choices are blowing into your face. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so again, we're going to go through air quality. This is the physical and chemical characteristics of the air blowing through your area. Collectively, we'll call that the air shed. Just like a watershed, we have movement from the upper air shed to the lower air shed. That's not an elevation change, it's a upwind toward downwind position movement, okay? We'll call this ecologically functional air. The characteristics of this air determine a lot of things. In fact, if you've ever heard of an ecosystem like cloud desert, anybody? Cloud desert is an arid environment where there's no rain. Literally zero rain all year round, or maybe a little bit here and there, like a couple of inches total in a year versus us getting 4 inches in one nasty afternoon, right? So a cloud desert gets all of its precipitation, all of its moisture in the form of fog blowing across the plants trying to grow in that desert. And if we change the quality of that air through things like climate change, then that cloud desert could start getting too much rain, or, it's not getting rain, too much precip. It might start getting rain where it's not adapted for rain, and it might get cut off based on changing air currents and dry out completely. There are some places on the surface of the earth that get basically zero precip or any moisture input year-round on a typical year basis. So this has some real consequences when we're talking about air quality. All right, so air quality specifically as a recreation resource, though, is going to be the extent to which it's not hurting our recreationists. And in some places, the mountains that we are managing as national parks are going to put people in a very dangerous or unsafe way with their airshed. In the same way that visitors going to the Grand Canyon can be put into a dangerous situation by the trails that you bring them down to get into the Grand Canyon that take them to the mighty and beautiful, but also deadly, Colorado River. So when we cut a road across Great Smoky Mountains National Park up over the spine of the mountains, call it a highway, and bring people up into pretty polluted airshed, that has real actual consequences for real actual human beings. In the same way that running a trail down to the Colorado is going to end up with a few people here and there drowning because they're not ready for the Colorado River. Okay? So let's talk about specifically impacts to air quality as a function of recreation or that recreationists have to deal with. So this is predicated on the basic human intuition that we shouldn't have to use particulate respirators to safely go for a hike. Has anybody ever done any wildland firefighting in a respirator? Has anybody taken like Forester 315? It is hot, sweaty, awful work. You are sucking air through a couple of layered filtration elements of different kinds so that you're not breathing in a bunch of essentially things like sulfuric acid particles in wood fire smoke. And it's hard to do the physical labor of wildland firefighting through that. And so it's not a particularly appealing thing to think forward to the future or think to places around the world where this is a thing today. It kind of is a pretty hard impact on the experiential resource of getting to go for a hike. We would call going for a walk outside, I'm stepping out to get a breath of fresh air. It's encoded into our language, how we think about air and its value as a recreation resource. So, our position is that Clean air is a fundamental forest recreation value, need, and ecosystem service. And so since the 1990s only, organizations like the National Park Service have really started to dive in on, okay, we have to deal with other people's bad choices as our air quality gets worse and worse, and we're pushing things like our climate off of a cliff. So, this is kind of why we're talking about this stuff today. Let's go through a couple of different classes of impacts. So, air quality impacts are going to look a lot like water quality impacts. And here's why. Air masses, chunks of air that are hot and cold, hot or cold, dense or not dense, full of saturated moisture, water vapor, not so full, like super dried off, right? Those physical characteristics sound a lot like the physical and chemical characteristics of water. Indeed, chunks of air in our atmosphere behave as fluids because air in an atmosphere is a fluid. Flowing fluids in the atmosphere you might call wind. That's the technical term. Okay. So, with air quality, we have chemical concerns. So that's stuff like, acid fog so it's the fog equivalent of acid rain in places that heat their homes with coal. So London in the 1800s and early 1900s, the acid fog got so bad that the famous London fog blowing through the streets and picking up sulfuric acid particles out of people's not low sulfur content coal-fired furnaces. Those particles, those dry sulfate aerosol particles, hit water droplets in the fog, turn into sulfuric acid, and were causing people's eyes to burn, like across an entire major city. London's pretty big around the year 1900, right? And it was so bad that, for example, things like grave markers and statues that were made out of calcareous minerals like limestone or marble, that sort of thing, the acid fog was etching those and literally dissolving the face off of humanoid statues and architecture. It got hard to read gravestones and like inscriptions on the corner of a building, this place was built in 17 whatever. Like, that stuff was getting gnawed away by acid fog. Can you imagine living your entire life in those conditions most days? London is a naturally pretty foggy place based on its position along the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. So we can load chemicals as a species into the air, and then that air goes somewhere, and whoever is downwind gets to deal with it. So when we're talking about things like wildfires showing up in places where we never thought we'd have to fight wildfires, like Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, northern Scandinavia, well above the Arctic Circle, and hundreds and thousands of large and small wildfires in places like that. When you take a look at the smoke plumes as photographed by like NASA's Earth Observatory, for example, those smoke plumes can go all the way around the planet at that latitude, carried by wind belts like the jet stream. And this literally happened in Australia several years ago, right? Was it 2018, 2019 when Australia had those absolutely bananas fires? And we sent a whole bunch of American smoke jumpers and hand crews and engine crews down there to help them. Those fires, or the smoke plumes, were on, I guess, the east coast, and it blew all the way around to the west coast of Australia and destroyed their air quality while those fires were going. So that's bad. And to the extent that those wildfires are intensified or pushed wider at the edges of the fire season by things like climate change, and also contribute to climate change, this is on us as human beings to cope with this, manage it, and try and get out in front of it. So, those chemical changes are going to be identified as chemical names. Sulfuric acid, H2SO4, or sulfate aerosol in solution. Particulate pollution is just, we'll call that inert particles, or sometimes they're not so inert. So diesel engines, for example. Diesel engines have since forever, based on how they burn diesel fuel, they put out a lot of particulate matter, of some complex organic molecules that are highly carcinogenic. And the problem with diesel particles coming out of the exhaust of somebody rolling coal in your face, or just not keeping their vehicle well in tune, or even a properly tuned vehicle is still doing this. The size of those particles is so small. They are nanoscale particles, right? So on the large size, millionths of a meter in diameter, and on the small end, billionths of a meter in diameter. They're so lightweight that they can stay in the air for a really long distance. They don't just come up out of the smokestack or the exhaust pipe of a big truck or something like that. They float and they disperse and they just blow and blow and blow and blow. So for example, there's a bunch of, this isn't a recreation impact, but it illustrates how recreation interfaces with it. There's a really sobering series of studies coming out of places like Los Angeles that track public health metrics, like how many kids at this elementary school versus this elementary school versus this elementary school, and all around Los Angeles, lots of elementary schools, tons and tons of kids, so you can get really detailed and accurate statistics. What's the percentage of each school's kids that are showing up with mild, moderate, severe asthma? And there was a very tight correlation, a very strong relationship that the researchers said, this is probably more than just correlation, this is probably causative. It's a super tight relationship with proximity to a highway upwind. So this is a tragedy of the commons problem. Everybody trying to get to work, a few real assholes trying to roll coal and blow thick black diesel smoke out of their exhaust to be cool, or what they think is cool, and a whole bunch of over-the-road trucking shipping, how our nation has chosen to do its logistics. That has the effect of making a whole bunch of kids real sick. And so people with asthma don't tend to live near as long, and they tend to get sick a lot more, and they tend to die from complications that arise from irritation, things even like lung cancer, from those diesel particles being so lightweight that when you breathe through your nose, and certainly through your mouth, they're light enough to get right past your sinuses and not just into your lungs, but like all the way down past most of the spongy material of your lungs, those alveolar sacs that do the actual oxygen exchange across the cellular membrane. And they just sit down there in your lungs, and these carcinogenic particles are just doing their thing. And your body cannot get them out. It's a one-way trip forever, or at least for the rest of your life. So this is a real issue. So when these kids go out to hang out on the playground, the only recreation they're getting while they're in school as children that should be getting a lot of play, both for its developmental and cognitive benefits, we're killing them. They're gonna die sooner because we're driving to work. Does that make sense? So that is a wicked problem trade-off. That is a tragedy of the commons. Our air is a common shared resource, and each of us can make the choice to extract our value out of that air, drive our car to work, and externalize some of the cost of that. We still gotta buy the gas, but somebody else has to breathe our exhaust, right? So this is a very, very difficult and intractable, in some places, kind of a problem. Particulate pollution leads to haziness or cloudiness, obscures things at distance. So this is not the same as cloud cover. This is, even on a clear day, you should be able to see 75 miles if you're up on a ridge of a given height above the terrain around it. but you can just see half of that distance, and everything beyond it just looks kind of gray and faded. That's particulate pollution. Sometimes particulate pollution is natural. So the Amazon rainforest, you may have heard of it, is fertilized by particulate transport from, does anybody know where? The Sahara Desert. Isn't that wild? Dust storms on the Sahara are fertilizing the forest that produces 1 in 5 of our breaths of oxygen. Very cool stuff. So when we mess with those big air currents and interrupt that flow and that delivery, big problems, like planetary scale problems. So that particulate, in that case, is natural and good. But for man-made particulates, they tend not to be inert particles like, I don't know what you could breathe in and be okay with, but they tend to, at least the ones we're concerned with, tend to cause things like cancer that we just can't stop, right? The double lung transplant list is pretty long. Okay, and then of course there's the aesthetic concern as well. So that's our high-level preview. And our chemical pollution as a function of recreation looks a lot like this. So this is an example of somebody having a really fun afternoon in their scale truck, funny truck, dirt track race or off-roading kind of event. Those chemicals, that carbon loading into the atmosphere is going to be around for a very long time. So short-term benefit, long-term cost, not great. But this is why credit card companies are such huge organizations. Immediate payoff, and we'll worry about the cost some other time. Somebody will invent something that'll clean up our atmosphere, right? Well, okay, we're in this phase of air pollution for the last couple of centuries now, and we're overdue, and a lot of people get sick, a lot of people die from this. So one thing that we are doing specifically with respect to recreational and non-recreational internal combustion engines is producing ozone, which is a highly reactive oxygen species. It's oxygen in our air, diatomic oxygen, natural normal oxygen, about 20% of our atmosphere, is 2 oxygen atoms held together by a double bond. Pretty reactive, but reasonably stable, right? If you light a match, it doesn't burn off the entire atmosphere. It just burns that typically solid or liquid fuel. Instead, ozone, which is an O3 molecule of very floppy and unhappy single bonds, triangular molecule that can form 2 bonds per member, is not a happy molecule. It is highly, highly reactive. And so naturally speaking, ozone is formed by things like lightning strikes, right? It takes a high energy input to take diatomic oxygen and crack it into its triatomic form. But with the advent of internal combustion engines, those run just hot enough to put out ozone. So at this point, we have about 1 billion, with a B, internal combustion engines in operation at any given moment around the surface of the Earth. That's a lot of ozone sources, okay? Ozone, when it gets into your body, makes you pretty unhappy on a cellular kinetics level. It's busy reacting with your tissue and breaking it down. You can use ozone, and it is used in hospital spaces to sterilize stuff. So if you're breathing ozone low-key all of your life, that's a problem. Ozone also likes to strangely enough, ozone is actually a perceptual value of forest and outdoor recreation. Has anybody ever been camping and there was a hard rainstorm, or backpacking maybe, and there was a hard rainstorm, and right after the rain stopped, the place smelled a little bit different, and it smelled like fresh and cool? Yeah, that's ozone, okay? That is ozone ambient nearby at an enriched rate based on a whole bunch of lightning strikes nearby. So there's this perceptual sense of, wow, the earth, after it has been cleansed lovingly by the gentle rains, is sorry, my asthma, right? Okay, so we get a bunch of hydrocarbons, poorly, incompletely combusted gasoline floating around in the air, breathing that in. It's like a bird. And then NOx compounds, nitric oxide, nitrous oxide. There's a whole bunch of different species or different chemicals of that, and sulfates and so forth. For some internal combustion engines, like two-stroke engines, so like a chainsaw engine, for example, or chainsaw motor, 20 to 30% of the gas that you're putting in that tank goes right out the exhaust port. Okay, so this is a huge problem because a lot of recreational motors are smaller, super dirty, burning oil with the gas, two-stroke motors, like a lot of dirt bikes, a lot of go-karts, a lot of lighter vehicles like some ATVs back in the day. Now they're mostly four-stroke, but four-stroke engines do this to some extent as well. If the car isn't perfectly tuned, and who among us has a perfectly tuned car, then we are putting some of that gasoline out into the air, and gasoline is just absolutely ruinous ecologically and to humans. Also, we get spillage and leakage of gasoline, and leakage of other volatile synthetic chemicals when you're driving that UTV over recreational terrain, maybe the desert floor, and you just hit a rock that's a little bit too tall for your ground clearance and stuff like that, and a lot of that stuff drips onto the rock and slowly bakes in the sun, and some of it washes into the water supply nearby, and some of it volatilizes off into the atmosphere and causes problems there. So the issue here is that NOx compounds are hugely, like more than 10 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in causing things like thermal forcing, climate change. Some of these compounds are 60 to 80 times as potent. So we're not putting out a ton of them, but we don't have to. If it's super strong, if the poison's super concentrated, you don't need to dose somebody like a horse to kill them off. Okay? So, air quality is a frustrating and difficult problem because it's baked into our travel and baked into the recreational activity on site as well. Okay? So, one two-stroke off-road motorcycle or ATV emits as much hydrocarbon pollution per mile as 118 passenger cars. On the tourism side of things, a big cruise ship. Has anybody ever been on a cruise? Pretty cool? Alright. Did you eat yourself silly? I mean, that's what one does on a cruise, right? Cool. So, a single cruise ship, which is not forest recreation, but it's in adjacent tourism industries, and a lot of cruise ships drop off thousands of visitors each time they cruise at each of the national parks along the coast that they stop by. That's part of what people are paying for the experience for. Each one of those cruise ships and the big sort of industrial container ships that are shipping cheap plastic crap from, a factory in Shenzhen, in China, or wherever cheap plastic stuff is manufactured to be used once and then landfilled. Ships like that and cruise ships, they're burning a kind of fuel called bunker fuel, which is basically all of the crap left over after you've pulled out gasoline and diesel from dirty crude oil. Bunker fuel is this just like gelatinous goo. It's actually solid enough at room temperature to walk across, right? You're burning tar, which, if you've ever seen like tar burning, it doesn't burn very cleanly, like huge, thick, oily plumes of smoke and all kinds of chemicals within that smoke. Per passenger, those cruise ships are emitting about 1,000 cars or light trucks worth of air pollution as they go. So a 5,000 passenger cruise ship, which is big, but it's not as big as they get. A 5,000 passenger cruise ship is emitting the same carbon and hydrocarbon pollution, and chemical pollution in particular, as 2 Cincinnatis. About 1 3/4 St. Louis's. Each one of those cruise ships, right? And they're pulling up to national parks. You see a problem here. National park, in a lot of cases, is downwind of a cruise ship. And those cruise ships, up until recently, like we talked about in the water section, hung on to their sewage until they got into port. And so while people were, off on the shore leave, gallivanting around the park for 6 hours before getting back on the diesel-powered bus to get back on the bunker fuel-powered cruise ship, they dump all of their sewage in port and just completely destroy the port's ecosystem completely. A single ship could kill it off completely. Just unbelievable. Imagine being a dolphin and you have to swim through a plume of like 5,000 people's feces stored up over the previous week. Right? That's the ecological reality of it. So this is a lot. Air pollution is tough, and because a lot of people are traveling super hard to get to distant national parks, like how many people are walking to Yellowstone National Park and having a light ecological footprint on the way? Close to zero. How many people are flying to Yellowstone National Park out of these several million people a year? So that's like millions and millions and millions, maybe into the billions, maybe into the tens of billions of air miles caused by the existence of that national park, or at least is caused by our desire to visit that national park in a way that is more time efficient and makes future generations cash the check that we are writing in terms of our emissions. Okay? Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere on average between 86 and 115 years, depending on which cycle, like the deep ocean carbonate cycle, is going to pull it out. Question?
So if they're like dumping stuff like cruise ships do, is that considered a point source or a non-point source? Because like, can they regulate that, or are they just like?
Yeah. So it took people kind of a while to figure out that A, this is a problem. B, this is a very objectionable problem. Like, you want your harbor smelling like that? And unfortunately, it took a while to sort of get enough compelling scientific evidence that we can, through the apparatus of government and onshore maritime law, regulate this stuff without the cruise companies just buying off the senators to do it. So now they release that stuff. I mean, they still do it, but they just do it where nobody can see, out at sea, and do it overnight. Good question. So you see the fundamental problem, right? We all want to get to a national park because they're amazing. And we all want to get to a national park without having to spend a 4-month walk to get there. And the drive is a lot of gas miles. And the flight is like a lot more gas miles. So to give us kind of an understandable sense of how carbon out of our tailpipes, and in particular out of airplane turbines, equates to something we can just like actually understand in recognizable, regular-ass human terms, would be something like each passenger's carbon contribution to the air on a transatlantic or trans-Pacific flight. If you fly from like Los Angeles to Tokyo Narita International Airport, your individual emissions, or mine, that's enough to melt 10 square meters or feet? Square meters? 100 square meters? Like a patch of ice up in the Arctic on that scale. So something like a small corner of this room to about the space of this room. Each person, one way, one flight. There are a lot of flights going all around, right? At any given moment, there's what, 1 million or more Americans in the air at any given time. And some of those are going to be longer flights. This stuff adds up, and it adds up real fast, way faster than our planet can draw this stuff back down and sort of clean these things out. So we have to take a look at when we are asking people to travel to national parks, what are we causing inadvertently, right? So they get the benefit, that direct benefit, and the externalized ecological cost, that's just the same as those cruise ship companies, okay? Now, if you're looking at 80 plus million visitor days in national forest, that number, if you widen it out to all human participation on national forests, is up in the hundreds of millions of days. So 200, 300, 400 million visit days to our national forest system. On the same order, 200, 300, 400 million visit days across the United States National Park System. That's a lot of travel. That's an absolutely crazy amount of carbon to pay for that travel. Okay? And this is what we're asking people to do, right? We can't bring the park to them. Except that the National Park Service, in partial recognizance of this, has started to do things like Ranger in the Classroom programs, where, especially for disadvantaged and mostly urban kids, lower socioeconomic status, that kind of stuff, park rangers will show up in uniform and bring a whole bunch of stuff from their nearby national park to more impoverished populations in places like Las Vegas and LA and so on and so forth. It's a really cool program, and that's one tailpipe to bring something closer to a bunch of folks who may not have the resources to access all the benefits, all the wonderful things that you're working so hard as a ranger for otherwise, okay? So, we get statistics like this. Snowmobile riders continuously exposed to unhealthy levels of carbon monoxide. If you've ever seen a cadaver of somebody who's been killed by carbon monoxide poisoning, it's horrific. Your skin turns this bright pink color because the carbon monoxide preferentially binds to hemoglobin in your red blood cells versus regular oxygen, and turns your blood this bright pink color. It's a pretty awful way to go. And on the way down, a lot of hallucinations, pretty scary or even terrifying experiences, and then you die. So people who commit suicide, for example, or take their own lives, this is one way that some folks have chosen to do that, and that's kind of the side effects of it. Very tough stuff. So you could think about riding on a snowmobile, snow machine, as it's super fun. It's like all the fun of an ATV with all the bumps kind of smoothed out, and you can just gas it and blast across that winter landscape. It is fun. But what these studies are saying is that part of what you're literally doing to yourself is, like, as you're on this thing riding along, you're impacting the soundscape. We'll talk about that in a bit. But it's also like you've got the tailpipe of your own vehicle and it's blasting you in the face. But low levels of carbon monoxide poisoning don't make you feel terrible. It might not be detectable, but it's still having its effect. It is still a bad idea to breathe a bunch of exhaust continuously for a couple hours as you're out snow machining and stuff like that. Okay? So, here is another issue. Not everybody is playing by the same rules. Not everybody believes they are subject to rules. So, just in the year 2004-2005 in the state of California, where air pollution is absolutely a major problem, in places like the Los Angeles Basin. We have most folks playing by the rules, and then about 1 in 4, when you add all these numbers together, 1 in 4 people using an unregistered vehicle. And typically the unregistered vehicles don't have anywhere near the emission controls or like the updated catalytic converter that California, being as anal retentive as it is about all kinds of environmental stuff, has required. And so this is a thing. This is a huge thing. And so those unregistered ORVs, or the ones that are not being maintained to the state's basic standard, right? We're not asking people to cure cancer. We're asking them to like get it checked out every 5 years to make sure it's not blasting like the worst of the worst chemicals into the air and into our lungs. Millions of these, and that's just the ones they were able to find out about. So we have a lot of recreational use being the highest impact per person use versus stuff like semi-tractor trailer trucks, which are pretty polluting, but they serve a lot of people per truck. An off-road motorcycle, highly polluting, and it's only serving one person. So we're paying more for the same unit of benefit, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? This is a really big deal. And if you think about kind of the not steady state use of an off-road motorcycle, you're not setting cruise control on your hog at 65 miles an hour and running a finely tuned engine down a highway. You're cranking, you're burying that tachometer needle, the RPMs meter in the red to get up a real steep slope because that's cool and fun. And then you're coasting, and then you're getting off, and you're pulling off your helmet and going, man, I full sent that. Wasn't that sick, bruh? And then cranking up that cold engine again and tearing off once again. So the use profile is different. The maintenance is different. The standard emission per unit of use is very different. And this is something we got to confront as park rangers. And so, how many of you guys have been to a national park where these things aren't allowed, period? Right? We can't stop everybody from using these things across open landscapes, like on BLM land, for example, Bureau of Land Management out west. But at least within the borders of a national park, the government is comfortable saying, you know what, guys? We can't handle this. This is just not healthy. This is not sustainable. We can't do this. So we're not going to. And that's a very calculated thing. There's a ton of research that goes into this stuff so that you can say with a straight face before a federal judge when you get sued for that decision that this is the right move and here are the data showing why. Okay? So this is what particulate looks like. Okay? And this is just the macro scale big stuff. This is like 1/10 of a millimeter on up. You can see visibly as specks floating in the air. Now, in this particular animated image, this is just mostly dead skin particles, right? That's the majority of the dust in an indoor environment. As gross as that is, we're all breathing each other's dead skin in. And when it's finer scale particles, this is from the movie Blade Runner. This is not a real environment. But here's the thing. The concept art or the concept photos taken around the world in places like the Beijing Plain, a bunch of places in India, it actually looks like this from time to time. Like, honest to God, looks like this. It can get that bad, and it is already getting that bad. So Ridley Scott made a slightly controversial decision to basically, for all of the outdoor shots, color grade the imagery to look like this. And a lot of people are like, this is so hokey, like that doesn't even look real. But this is like the daily lived experience most of the year for close to 3 billion people between India and China. And those aren't the only two countries where it gets this bad. So
wildfire, days that look like that.
Yeah.
Sunny days
Yep.
that look like that.
Yeah. So when you see color changes, that's typically a chemical effect. When you see Like a volcanic eruption very commonly causes green-colored sunsets. Really freaks people out because those sulfate aerosol particles getting blasted into the stratosphere, literally, above earthly weather, can go all the way around the world and turn, during major eruption events, change the climate for up to a couple of years at a time, and change the color of the sunsets for a while. It's pretty unnerving when you see it if you're not expecting it. This cinematograph is, or I guess this looping image, is an illustration, a visible illustration of how fluids flow. So let's talk about how the physics of air just kind of steer some of this particulate pollution directly into our faces instead of cleaning it up and away somewhere where we're not going to breathe it. Before Cape Air switched over to, I don't know, whatever new company is at the airport, has anybody ever taken, this is so cool and gross, has anybody ever taken the commuter flight between Marion Williamson Airport and St. Louis? Like you were flying somewhere else, so you got the little connector flight? Okay, that flight goes just high enough to get into the smog layer. And we are down airshed from St. Louis, so you get up to cruising altitude. It's only a 50-minute flight, but your eyes start burning, your nose starts running and stuff like that, and it's like, why do I feel nasty? And then you drop down below it, and everything's fine again, and you land in St. Louis, or you land in Marion if you're going the other way. And it's just an illustration of the atmosphere, especially below the tropopause, the upper elevation limit for weather, and atmospheric mixing, is heavily stratified into layers like this. And this one we can see based on cloud or fog particle transport. But this is happening at all layers of the atmosphere above us all the time. We just can't normally see it. Okay, so we sort these as densest at the bottom, and then coldest and thinnest at the top. Now, the reason we have weather is because the hottest air wants to be not dense, but that's where it is, okay? And the thinnest air way up at Mount Everest, for example, where the partial pressure of oxygen is barely enough to have a human survive on. Most folks climb up there these days with oxygen bottles. It's real cold up there, and the atmosphere is very thin, but cold air wants to become dense and drop. So that's how we get thermal mixing of these different layers. That's how we get atmospheric turbulence. If you're a fan of flying, that's how we get this mixing and seething cauldron of, in this case, relevant to our discussion, the particulate pollution trapped in one of these layers and maybe blowing across your face as we go. Okay? So, when we have pollution trapped in a single layer of air, typically down in a valley where the wind can't clear it out, that's called a temperature inversion or a thermal inversion. And in places like the Los Angeles basin, this actually leads to, I mean, anytime like the Santa Ana winds have like a cold, dense dome over all of everybody's millions of tailpipes rolling constantly in Los Angeles. I think this is the San Francisco Bay Area. Anytime you have that cold, dense air trapping that warm air that's trying to seethe its way out, but all the particulate stuff is just building up because it's trapped in there, trapped in by those mountain ranges on all sides, then you take a look at the death rate, and it goes up. Like, people legit die from this stuff. Now, it's typically people who are already pretty sick, maybe from a lifetime of smoking or something like that. But it pushes some people beyond what their bodies can cope with, and they just die because the weather changed a little bit. Because we drive a lot of vehicles. Because those vehicles produce a whole lot of particulate and chemical or dissolved gas pollution. Okay? Cool. I'm over time. We got to stop here. So, happy Thanksgiving, dudes and dudettes. Next week at this time-ish. Be safe traveling, and yeah, Thanksgiving is next week, right? I'm not totally hallucinating. All right, good. Cool. All right.